Hi Ved, what's up, man? It's been a difficult week, I suppose.
It has, it has. It's been a very difficult week. So that's why we couldn't record, no, last week.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's been particularly damaging in these parts. There's been no internet, no television connectivity. In fact, the chief minister said there are two districts that need to be rebuilt from scratch, and it's been difficult to follow the news. So, like, in fact, you would know better what's happening in the more remote parts of the city, like the
Mm-hmm.
ones I can't see before me, because we haven't had a TV or an internet line for the last 4 5 days.
Yes.
But yeah, when we did get the line though, I found it very funny that there should be more localized reportage during these times, right? But the reportage is very funnily skewed yet again towards the political part of it and like the economic nuance and like very long term and macro factors, especially in the national media.
Mm.
You don't like the English broadcasting channels. You don't find local reporting. Like I'd rather they put up a helpline number or they connect you to volunteer workers and social workers or actually helping you clear the damage after the storm. But they're not doing that. I think like the media has played a very funny role this time around.
Yes, and I think there's been a large degree of apathy, so to speak, for want of a better
Mm,
word, from large sections of the
mm,
Indian national media. I was trying to follow, the print media as well as the broadcast media because most of the
mm,
content is online these days. And
yeah.
I barely saw any mention of Amphan. I barely saw any detailed coverage. In fact, what is even more
Mm,
ironic is that international outlets, for example, like the
mm,
BBC, like Al Jazeera, like The Guardian,
mm,
they had
mm,
detailed coverage. They had detailed
mm,
coverage involving different sites of the cyclone, where it hit, the kind of effects it had. But whereas the national media was fairly lukewarm about it.
mm,
I mean, the
mm,
only exceptions I would say would probably be places like The Wire in terms of the digital
mm,
platforms and in terms of broadcast NDTV. But apart from
mm,
that, I mean, you look at Republic, you look at Hindustan Times, you look at
yeah.
even the Hindu for that matter. They did not really cover
Mm,
this in as much detail as they should have, and
mm,
this is ridiculous, right? Because this is one of
mm,
the worst disasters to hit Calcutta and Bengal this century.
mm,
Never mind
mm,
in the last few years. It was very scary for me as well because even though like obviously I'm 5,000 miles away, it was very scary when I had absolutely no connection
no
with my
touch with your
family
family.
for
Yes.
yeah for a
Mm,
good 12 15 hours. And I would say
mm,
that I was still lucky because I came to know later on that there were people who were without any telephone network, without any electricity, without any water as well
mm,
for
mm,
more than
mm.
24 36 hours.
Oh, people
So
still are. Like large parts of the even the electric supply hasn't been restored.
hmm. Yes, and also just to see
So
the kind of
mm,
flooding that's taken place. I mean, now I think it's cleared up, but initially the
yeah.
sight of College Street and all the books was floating on the
Mm.
water was pathetic. I never thought I'd see something like that, really.
Oh, gosh, I didn't see that. I didn't see that. Terrible.
Yeah,
Okay.
man.
So I was thinking, how this is a very apt example of the mediatization of our entire social system in India. How
Hmm.
what the media says and what we then by extension consume just happens to end up being the narrative. And if you're in the local area, if you're on ground zero, you end up with some kind of a dissonance. You realize it's not what's like the right narrative isn't going out there, but that's just it. Then it dies out. So I think like the change in narrative and what like the role of the media and what it must do in reporting these situations, that it's more helpful and less sensational, has to
Hmm.
be taken, has to be like, given a relook.
Yeah. I completely agree with what you're saying, but if you look at the realities, one of the reasons why I think isn't happening, like we don't get enough coverage of natural disasters like Amphan, and even now with the locusts, the locust mess that is ravaging large parts of North India, there is very little coverage of that in prime time television. I think one of the main reasons for that is you cannot sift these news events through the usual binaries of class, caste, religion, and you cannot create that kind of polarized discourse that mainstream media essentially survives on these days. And I think, I mean, it's very easy to sort of jump to conclusions and say, look, that's because like all channels have an agenda and all of them like are sort of irresponsible in fulfilling the role of the fourth estate. I mean, obviously they are to a certain extent, but the deeper realities of Indian journalism lie in the financial structures of Indian journalism. Because I was listening to this interview Rajdeep Sardesai gave to this platform called the Algebra, which was I think earlier this year, sometime earlier this year, and he was talking about the reason you don't have good quality news on Indian mainstream media, especially broadcast media, is simply because there is nobody to pay for that. right? I mean, you look at the kind of money people pay for broadcast channels on cable television these days. It's a pittance, right, that they pay. And even for the print media, like for 2 rupees, you can for 2 rupees or under, you can get what 25, 30 pages of coverage. And this I'm talking about the English dailies. And all the revenue systems either come from certain oligopolies,
Corporate.
or they come from, yes, corporates, or even government advertisement, right? And just to sort of complete the financial point, compare this to America, where to begin with, obviously, you have whole lot of freedoms in terms of what the press can say, because the First Amendment is very capacious in the American Constitution. It essentially allows you to say anything and everything under freedom of speech. But even if we go to the more pragmatic concerns of media, a government like a Republican government led by Trump cannot withdraw its advertising revenue to your New York Times, even if the New York Times continues to castigate Trump in the way that it does. So they essentially are part of an ecosystem, and that ecosystem cannot be disrupted by a particular regime. Whereas you see what happens in India, and this is not just the case for the central government, but even across state governments for years, the ones in power will just threaten to pull out their advertisements, without which a lot of publications, especially regional publications, will not be able to survive. So the whole financial model is messed up, man.
Yeah, so if you notice, like just to add, like I take no opposition to that. I think the large parts of, I think more than 51% of Indian media
Hmm.
is owned either by your corporates or by Indian politicians themselves.
Yes.
And I mean just the equity structure, not even where they get in their advertisement revenue from.
Hmm.
So, which also biases you from the get-go, because you cannot report some things which are against your own, which against your corporate master,
Exactly.
which leaves you with very little, because every corporation or every political body has some kind of an outlet.
Hmm.
And even though they're competing in their own political and corporate space, they are also competing in the media space.
Hmm.
So if you just happen to fund the media house that's doing well, it is less likely that news which doesn't portray you in a good light is going to go out there,
Yeah.
which you see so clearly, right?
Hmm. And again, to sort of draw a comparison, the problem in India is that there is a very strong nexus between the corporate sector and the politicians. I mean, whether it be the Modi government or even the UPA too before that, they were largely bankrolled by a small section of industrialists, right? And this small section of industrialists is again the very same group of people that own most of the media outlets. You compare this to an America, and you look at what the Washington Post does, which is owned by Jeff Bezos, right? But it can directly take on a Donald Trump, and in fact, Donald Trump has gone to the extent of calling it the Amazon Washington Post. But a Washington Post is able to do that kind of journalism because there is no nexus between a Bezos and a Trump. I'm not saying that there is no nexus at all between American industrialists and American political parties. But the fact is, there is much greater autonomy for businessmen and industrialists to actively be interested in quality journalism, which you don't really see in India, because what these media houses become is that they become mouthpieces for certain industrial, corporate, commercial interests. Nobody is really investing for the sake of journalism. So, I mean, again, to sort of go back to the Sardesai point, what he suggested was that, you take all the billionaires in India, or you take like even a small fraction of the billionaires in India, ask them to each pool in, like 100 crores, and then they will create the best channel that can exist. Because, and this is very similar to what has happened in Qatar with Al Jazeera, because for a very long time, sort of broadcast agenda was mainly dominated by the West, right? So ever since CNN started, primetime coverage became the first 24-hour news channel. Major events of the world, be it the Gulf War, be it Afghanistan, be it Iraq, 9/11, all of these were covered from the Western perspective. Channels like CNN, channels like the BBC. But with the rise of Al Jazeera, which sort of happened somewhere in 2004, 2005, the global south got a new voice. So now Al Jazeera is a global player, and it's sort of portraying the Middle East and directly countering the hegemonic narratives that the West has established for a very long time. I mean, most pronounced of those narratives would be the pro-Israel stance from the West, and with Al Jazeera coming up with the pro-Arab stance. So why don't we have something like this in India, man? Is my question, and I think the answer lies in the
Fair.
fact that we don't have a model, and no, and perhaps more than that, we don't have the motivation. Like the people who have the resources don't have the motivation to invest in quality journalism.
No, I think it's because it boils down to a very simple marketing question, that it's very difficult to study what the Indian consumer wants to consume on a macro, more uniform level, because our tastes, our preference patterns, especially in something like news, is very different because our intellectual classes, our economic classes, our cultural tastes are different from even like from one city to the other.
Hmm.
If you notice, so what News Laundry did an interesting thing. They brought out literally for every major media house in India, they took out diagrams of their ownership structure.
Mm-hmm.
And like if you just scroll through it, you find perhaps the most independent holding structure is of Bennett Coleman. I don't know, but I found like the Jain family that holds it has little direct political contact. Of course, they have a nexus with them, but they're not politicians by themselves. Now, for something like the Times of India, right? Take Kolkata for example. They haven't been able to beat the Telegraph for donkey's years now.
Hmm.
In terms of how widespread the readership is, because you need to put in that amount that specific customized tailored content which appeals to that area. And there's a mental block in terms of what consumers want. So there are people who will blindly agree with the Telegraph because it's been the leading daily and it's somehow garnered some kind of opinion leadership. So I think mindsets are more difficult to change in India as compared to like other places.
Of course, I completely agree.
Because you can't a one size fits all news for the entire country is more difficult to give out here.
Yeah. Completely agree with that, man. But I also think there are two other points that sort of contextualize the situation, right? First is when it comes to the Indian mass and in fact any public that is consuming media, supply creates its own demand to a large extent. So if you create a certain brand of journalism, you will automatically have consumers for that brand of journalism, which what explains the rise of Arnab Goswami and the ability of Arnab Goswami to retain a large section of his fan base, if you want to put it that way, even though his basic journalistic ethos has done a full 180. Right? I mean, going from the kind of watchdog questioning journalism that he used to do for Times Now during his frankly speaking interviews or even in his 9 p.m. debates to basically just pandering to the government in power, which he does for the Republic. But the other thing to consider in this context is that when you look at digital publications, let's say places like The Wire, which don't really have a commercial interest. I mean, it's a no-profit organization, The Wire. The problem is a lot of these digital organizations that are coming up are being impeded by the whole conundrum of trying to balance legal issues with maintaining journalistic values. Because what is happening is that when a Wire, let's say, publishes a particular story, for example, it did a story on UP talking about Aditya Nath and how Aditya Nath had participated in a sort of religious gathering during the pandemic. An FIR was filed in the name of the Wired editor, founding editor, Siddharth Varadarajan, I think. Yeah, that's what his name is. So, and this is just one of the thousands of cases that are running in the courts. And again, I mean, you may not have somebody who's in jail because of this, unlike the UAPA, which is like a whole ball game altogether. But what happens is that for publications like this, they have to pay their legal fees, right? They have to send lawyers, they have to make sure that appearances are made by the concerned journalists or editors, which takes away a lot of their resources. So after a point in time, they just lose the motivation, and they start sort of succumbing to the powers that be. And perhaps one example of that, I'm not sure if this is a presumptuous statement to make at this time, perhaps it is, but I have been seeing a shift in sort of the kind of narrative that comes across in this publication called The Print, which is a digital publication, ironically, but it's usually been fairly anti-government and anti-incumbency, but over the last two months or so, even in light of the reportage around Cyclone Amphan, I have seen a shift in their perspective, shift in their allegiance, if you will, and maybe that is a result of the crumbling pressures of power.
Exactly. So you combine those 2 points, right? You notice Arnab Goswami's trajectory, right? From the time he was at the news desk and on your TV screen with Sardesai at NDTV to when he was doing beautiful journalism at 2611, which is when he rose to fame. And he literally called politicians on his show and he ripped them apart.
Yeah.
And he was doing bullseye journalism, right? And up to when he suddenly started tilting towards the Modi government. And then he went outright when he left Times Now and started with Republic, he went outright anti-Congress and pro-BJP and is a blind supporter.
Yeah.
In fact, to the extent of literally like coaxing, mollycoddling, like sucking up to these people, right? So he's somewhere lost his independent brand of journalism, which can really be a result of some coercion somewhere. Like you never know. And like so some of the trajectory changes are very funny. Even in the Telegraph, if you compare a 2013 article on how they were criticizing the Manmohan Singh government And when Modi takes out even a single economic policy or a line on the economy, just a statement, they suddenly counter it with something which Dr. Manmohan Singh must have said, and they edify and like they put Manmohan Singh into a halo and compare and show how the Congress's economic policy would have been far better. Right? It's
Yeah.
almost ludicrous.
Hmm.
You just need to throw their old 2013 headlines back in them to tell them they're hypocrites. So I
Yes.
think coercion just has played a large part, but because
Hmm.
our consumption of content is so dependent on the media, we'll never have such news of the media. So you'll never
Yes.
be able to know what goes on behind the scenes.
Hmm.
But I think whether independent journalism will be able to stand up will not be a function of whether they can stand up to legal cases or this kind of coercion, right? It will be more in terms of whether they get a niche consumer base. What happens largely is that the minute you've tapped into a particular way and they're willing to stand with you or they're willing to give you just that economic front or like a corporate that is willing to go independent and fund you even if you're going against the media, going against the government, you're far more likely to sustain. Like it's more grounded in reality.
Hmm.
It doesn't matter what your ideology is because see the government's gonna change, right? Even if you're pro Modi, there's gonna come a time where you're no longer the favorite because Modi's not the favorite.
Hmm.
So more than fighting against the political system, it's about whether you have a wide enough consumer base, you have a corporate funding you, and you have the petty functionaries here and there who are keeping you in touch with the administration.
Yes. Except that,
Because
yeah. Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. So I think when you talked about the UAPA, right? You only told me a few days back about that Zara, the photojournalist, I forget her name,
Masrat
right?
Zaheda,
Who was
yes,
caught in
yes.
Kashmir, Masud Zara, right?
Yeah.
Who was caught in Kashmir, right?
Yes.
You have absolutely like there's this complete clarity on why they would use something like the UAPA to now start attacking journalists because the arrest laws are different. The way you put them before the magistrate is different.
Hmm.
How and for how long you hold them in custody is different.
Yeah.
It's a national security act, right?
Exactly. So
So
there is
the
no
way in
basis
which
for
they
arrest,
treat them
effectively. Like
is
you don't need to justify.
absolutely,
Don't need to give a justification for the
absolutely
arrest. Yes.
nothing. Which is why you're so low on the press freedom in there.
Yeah.
Right? India is one of the worst countries there. I think it's largely a function of how the people don't support good content.
Exactly.
And it's a vicious cycle. It's because India has never had good media content. Of course, apart like barring a few exceptions.
Yeah, and I think the problem is once you start democratizing something, you automatically
Mm-hmm.
start creating problems that come with expanded reach, right? So let's say a situation where you have a newspaper like The Statesman, which did some excellent journalism back in the day, especially in Eastern India. Now, The
Uh,
Statesman, why was it held to such a high standard? Because it was able to create dialogue within certain echelons of society. Now, once media access increases, the agendas of newspapers also change, right? Because then it has to talk in different tones, in different languages to appeal to everybody. And in trying to appeal to everybody, it essentially ends up appealing to nobody. And the more democratized a culture you make in a media house, what also ends up happening is that somewhere down the line you also have to secede a certain amount of your financial sort of hegemony, so to speak, right? So you have to drop your paywalls, or in certain cases not have a paywall at all. In which case I think it's very interesting to study how international publications are conducting themselves with respect to this fundamental question: do you have a paywall or not? You look at right now,
yeah.
the New York Times has it, the Guardian does not, the Washington Post has it, but obviously the BBC does not. The BBC does not because the BBC charges a license fee anyway from the UK citizens. But for international audiences, it doesn't have a paywall. The Economist has a selective paywall in the sense that you can only read certain amount of articles per month. But I think this is what Indian outlets have to do. And the reason they can't do this is because, as you said a little earlier, the people are not interested in good content, or even if they are, they don't want to pay for it, right? So we don't want to pay for journalism because it is a service at the end of the day, right? Just as you get your food, just as you get your other essential commodities, your medicines and everything, journalism and news is also a service. It's not something that just exists like air and you just consume it, right? Because if you do, then automatically you would be consuming a lot of polluted air, which is what is happening with polluted journalism. So people have to realize across India, across all sections of society, that they have to pay for news, and if they don't pay for news, they will essentially pay in terms of misinformation, if you know what I mean, like pun intended.
So in the sense that draws you back to that first point, I think. it's not fair to even tell either side that the content isn't appealing to to tell the journalists that the content isn't appealing to their consumers, or to tell people who are reading their papers that look that they should be interested in better content because that content isn't naturally appealing to them. And the problem there is that the kind of news you want or the kind of just content you want to read or like watch is very different even in the same household in India
Hmm.
or in the same geographical spaces, which is largely how the print functions, even online, right? Which is how the broadcasting and digital media functions. Because the education dissimilarities, the workspace dissimilarities are stark.
Yeah.
And like I can't authoritatively say that it's the most stark or like the most diverse content consumption you'll find anywhere in the world. But
Hmm.
I can say it's difficult for new journalists, new media house to pander to more than one very niche consumer base
Yeah.
because possibly churn out content which is appealing to more than one segment. Like the thing is started out with like Ampan.
Hmm.
If Republic or Vion or Times Now were to go ahead and start reporting helplines for Kolkata and very hyper localized news,
Yeah.
they are not going to be able to appeal to a consumer in Delhi or Mumbai because they're
Yeah.
still very much concerned with their local news there.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
what you can do is you can aggregate the factors. So it's very interesting. It goes back to what the structures which we on a macro level look at and how good or bad they are.
Hmm.
So the only thing you can do for major media houses is aggregate and bring it back to whatever is a more macro narrative. Stuff like
Yeah.
politics, stuff
Yeah.
like national security or wars, and which is also what governs the election issues, right? So that is what like the concept of mediatization, that the media is influencing your political narrative. It's not just reporting it.
Hmm.
So as soon as they're aggregating it, it then boils down to what are the nuances of of political or economic or larger narratives which everyone is interested in.
Yeah.
Do we want it to be sensational? Is there a particular happening which is being reported? I'm sure if there's a standoff, which if the China-India standoff worsens in the next few days,
Hmm.
the media is going to start reporting more nuanced versions of it and not just the basic political drama between Congress and BJP.
Hmm.
It's about how detailedly available the news is on the narrative that is more macro.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen. And that's because we have structural flaws in how our politics and how our economy functions, right?
Hmm.
We don't understand how they function. We just need the headline. And I think a
Yes.
big problem is a large part of India's inability to, without stereotyping, of course,
Hmm.
inability to consume anything beyond the headline.
That's becoming a sort of part of a culture which is just based around rapid consumption, right? Because you need your sound
Hmm.
bites, you need your little tidbits of news, which is why an application like InShots, which is actually
Hmm.
works fairly well, but an application
Yeah.
like InShots
Yeah.
comes into play because it aggregates news reports, crystallizes them within like 150 and 200 words, and that's how most people get their news. And apart from like the Facebook alerts and certain people who are active on Twitter, but I think with respect to sort of Indian media in general, there are two phenomena that we need to take into account, which kind of explains everything that we have been speaking about so far. One is the glocalization of news. What I mean by glocalization is what you just said right now, that you have these meta
Yeah.
narratives and you try to fit all local issues into these meta narratives. Sometimes these meta narratives can be global narratives as well, or at least global patterns. So, for example, right wing authoritarianism, nationalism, all of these are global patterns, right? So you take any issue, let's again, classic example, Arnav Goswami, Republic TV, the Palghar lynching case, right? Not a communal issue at all, but then a channel like Republic, which probably has the highest viewership among Indian English news channels, it makes it into a communal issue because it has to fit it to these global narratives of communalism, of ethnic struggle. So you have what like you can locally call or loosely call global globalization, an integration of global narratives with local issues. And the second effect or second phenomenon is what is the foxification of news, essentially named after Fox News, right? And what's happened with Fox News is
Uh-huh.
that you have news that's been made into a kind of infotainment. So not only do you have information, most of which is not subject to scrutiny, uh, but you also have it packaged in a certain way that appeals to the baser needs of an audience. So the needs of an audience to see people just rile each other up, to see people even indulge in physical confrontation. Like certain Hindi news channels in India have resulted in live physical violence, where the panelists are just beating each other up, which is utterly ludicrous. But that's
Mm-hmm.
happening. That's happening, and that's why a channel like Republic TV
Mm-hmm.
can flourish, because it creates
Mm-hmm.
those boxes. I mean, of course, there are boxes on the screen that you see from which panelists speak, but it also creates these ideological
Mm-hmm.
boxes, and it all comes down
Mm-hmm.
basically from the legacy of Fox, because prior to that, Western media, broadcast media, was supposed to be absolutely impartial. It wasn't supposed to be opinionated at all, which is kind of what the BBC is doing right now. So I'll just give you an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
The BBC has
Mm-hmm.
still held on to its legacy of being absolutely impartial, no matter what your
Mm-hmm.
definition of impartiality is, in terms of broadcast coverage. So recently, I think this was sometime last week, Emily Matlis, who's one of the prime hosts for BBC, and she hosts
Yes.
the
Yeah.
9 p.m. debate, or the 9 p.m. sort
Mm-hmm.
of broadcast, prime time broadcast. She was put under immense scrutiny, and BBC, in fact, issued a statement saying that her program did not adhere to the BBC's standards of impartiality, simply because she called out Dominic Cummings, who's Boris Johnson's aide, for violating the lockdown
Mm-hmm.
measures that the UK government had
Okay.
itself set,
Yeah.
right? So Emily
Mm-hmm.
Matlis basically used certain adjectives to talk about Cummings's
Mm-hmm.
behavior, how it was irresponsible, how it was dangerous.
Okay.
And for that, the
Mm-hmm.
BBC actually released a statement saying this does not fit in with the BBC's standards of journalism. Now imagine how long a statement a BBC
Mm-hmm.
would have to issue if an Arnab Goswami ever hosted a program on it, right?
We cannot. We cannot. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Fair.
and
So,
this is the
uh,
original
go on, go
broadcast
on.
standard. This is the original broadcast standard that places like the BBC and the CNN initially brought in. But
Mm-hmm.
most places
Mm-hmm.
have completely reversed that, where broadcast media has become the source of opinionated journalism, and you get more depth and a certain degree of better balance in print.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fair. So, see, so on that, I'd reverse the supply demand point, right? I think for things like the BBC, which are such as massive organizations with worldwide reach, there is a demand for specifically BBC or specifically Reuters content, right? Which is not going to happen if an Indian media house suddenly converts to being unbiased, right? Or even if a new media outlet starts tomorrow. Now, why that is because we are very highly accustomed to an Arnab Goswami. If you notice, Arnab Goswami also, so like just to put it out there, is he has 51% of the 9 p.m. news TRP, right, every day, and that's for a large number of weeks in a year, unless he falsely reports it himself, right?
Yeah.
That's because that's because people aren't as interested in the political happenings or the social happenings, not to stereotype, right? But they won't remain as interested in the happenings as they would in a US or a more Western liberal democracy, right? Now, why that is that because we have structural flaws again. So if you notice, the media, whether it's BBC or it's Republic, is largely reactionary in the kind of content it's giving up. And a BBC, if it starts in its infancy in India, is not going to find that level of reception because the demand here is for content which appeals to people who aren't part of the structure, right, and don't want to be drawn into the structure because they don't think it's something which is going to, like, news as a structure is essentially going to help them. Like the level to which, like, if you give me a presidential debate between a Rahul Gandhi and a Modi, and it's aired on all the major channels, by the time the third prime ministerial debate comes about, people won't watch beyond the 4 to 6 minutes, right? Unless, of course, it's just the barbs and exchanges. On the
Yeah.
other hand, they talk in detail about the economy. They talk about their plans and bringing soldiers back home and the bills they're going to pass, and literally right down to what they define the poverty line to be up in America. And you find people tuning in. You won't get that here because
Yes.
it requires a certain degree of uniformity in structure for people across places and ages to subscribe to that kind of content.
And
And I think that's the problem.
yes, and also because it's important to understand elections in India are not really a national affair in the sense that most media houses would
Mhm.
like to portray. So there is a very interesting
Mhm.
book that Pronoy Roy, founding editor of the NDTV, wrote, called The Verdict, in which he talks about
Uh,
how this whole idea of, Modi versus Rahul for the 2014 elections, or Modi versus who in the 2019 elections, was largely a
mm,
narrative that was brought about by select media channels, whereas the ground reality was
mm,
very different, because the Lok Sabha
mm,
elections, according to Pranay Roy, are not really a national election. They are a set of
mm,
state elections, each with its own issues and narratives, that ends up accumulating and forming the final verdict. So, yeah, in a state like Karnataka, the situation is entirely different, and issues are entirely different to a state like Tamil Nadu. And similarly in Bengal, whereas in Odisha you might find a different narrative, and maybe in North India there's a different narrative. So I think that's another problem with India, because there are so many different narratives at so many different levels that it becomes very difficult for media houses to actually appreciate the complexity. And also in terms of resources, they don't really have either the time or the money to do justice to all of those narratives. So what they do is blatant reductionism, right? They take an issue, try and filter the issue through binaries, and then project the issue through binaries that it becomes appealing to the lowest common denominator, essentially, in the whole paradigm. And that is what creates propagandist journalism, or that is what creates the kind of tokenistic journalism that we get from most places today. So yeah, I mean, it's a complex problem. I mean, I don't think there is a one step solution to all of this. There is also no one step solution to suddenly getting the Indian audience invigorated for a series of presidential debates. Like, just to give you an anecdote, last December, just before they had the polls here in the UK, since I was still here in the UK back then, I watched an ITV debate between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn, right? And it was moderated by a broadcaster, an ITV broadcaster, and she put forward the main issues, and there were audience questions as well. And it just struck me like how I can never imagine this happening in India. I mean, even if you leave aside the fact that a Modi would never debate on a public platform, and perhaps a Rahul could never debate on a public platform, you cannot imagine any politician for that matter coming across and having that kind of an exchange moderated by a commercial broadcaster, right? And the reason for that is we don't have that culture. We don't have that culture of journalistic debate. What we have today is basically journalistic discord, where people are just shouting. And it becomes essentially a soap opera. Because 9 p.m. you can have your typical Indian soaps, or you can have your shouting matches. So it's just become a situation where we need to revive the whole art of dialogue, the whole art of conversation. And according to that, you will see a certain change in journalism as well.
So that's difficult, because in the sense that I don't think it's possible even in the near distant future. That is because we have a systemic flaw in terms of how conversations function for people with different educational or different intellectual backgrounds in India. It's largely centered around not appreciating nuance, or suddenly hitting a common spot, or suddenly hitting something which is which is appealing to the other person, because we have a very ingrained culture of appeasement, right? You're looking at people and trying to garner a resource out of them, instead of literally trying to encourage them, develop an empathy, or have a qualitative conversation. The idea of a qualitative conversation or engaging citizen to citizen, I don't think exists outside the circles which you and I know, like the college goers or the debaters, because it's more about how the person in front of you can quickly become a resource which can somehow help you in your hustle. And I found this common across age groups and across across different locations, right? And I won't venture as far as to give a reason as to why it happened, but I want to stop at saying that this phenomenon is very evident, and it's what stops us from consuming content like that debate, because the understandings will be very different. Even if you somehow got a Modi and a Rahul to hypothetically speak at the same platform with some neutral moderation, right? You will find there are no issues where the two of them can talk about while reaching out or being heard by the specific segments which they want to draw their voter basis from. Because they, from the get-go, bank on an idea of polarization. Either you are an X party supporter or you are a Y party supporter. And no debate on an issue can change which way you go.
Yes.
It's a very identity-based or a very local based, or the person who's got your local ticket based factor. Right? And that's not something that happens so much in the West Liberal democracy. So the Congress doesn't even declare a candidate. Right? So polarly opposed to what happens in America, because they're never sure about what the voters are going to turn up and say. If the narrative is that a particular area, or a particular demographic, a particular linguistic part of the country has thrown up a majority for the Congress, then they're going to put a particular person in charge. If they see a different demographic is what has brought them into power or not, they're going to put a different person in charge. No one would have imagined Mallikarjun Kharge and not Rahul Gandhi being leader of opposition in 2014. Right? So I think our decision are largely based on how best to pander to the people who are making it possible for me to be here than to engage in a qualitative, more like foresight based, like engage with them on a more foresight based level.
Yes, absolutely. And I think as we wrap this up, because we're almost on borrowed time now, as we seem to be on
Oh,
every
okay.
episode. But as we
Sorry.
wrap this up, I think it's important to understand also that, according to like my perspective, the kind of world that I'm looking at, because I
Yeah.
intend to be a journalist and I have got a bit of a taste as to what this profession already is about.
Yeah.
There are two main problems, right? First, I think, is the fear to tell the truth, and second is, even if you overcome that fear to tell the truth, there is nobody to listen. So we have to tackle those issues as a society, and this cannot be done by the trailblazing work of a single journalist. So, notwithstanding the incredible journalism that, let's say, a Ravish Kumar does for NDTV, or the kind of interviews that a Karan Thapar does for English outlets, you cannot change the entire culture of the country on the basis of single individuals. It needs to be a cultural change. And that cultural change, as you said, has to come about through the integration of economics, politics, education, and above all, the whole idea of appreciating the news sector as something that is of value and not just, a background noise. Because it's kind of become a background noise. People just, I have seen so many of my friends just, just sitting on their couches and either having food or doing
Oh,
something on their
I'll tell you
laptops.
something. When in a Gujarati household, when Arnab Goswami comes on,
Hmm.
at 8:30 Tarak Mehta plays, right? At 9 o'clock Tarak Mehta ends.
Hmm.
So they want to continue the entertainment and they just switch to Republic.
Exactly. That
There's
was
absolutely no desire to get news.
Exactly. That is my point. Like, people, I've seen my friends sort of sitting on couches and playing on their laptops or on their phones, whereas
Yeah.
Arnab just blares in the background, and every now and then they'll get hooked by something he says, and then end of the show,
Mm,
end of the day. So we can't
mm,
afford that kind of
yeah.
journalism, man. I mean,
Mm.
and that is the
But
biggest,
so,
yeah.
yeah, go on, complete.
Yeah, and that is the biggest travesty, because we spend so much of this podcast talking about Arnab Goswami, and the biggest
Mm,
travesty about Arnab Goswami is that he's not inherently supposed to be a kind of figure that he is today, right? He's not supposed to be a demagogue,
mm,
because we have seen the kind
mm,
of incisive journalism that he can do. But the fact that
mm,
he's reduced to what he is today shows the
mm.
structural vulnerabilities of Indian
Wow.
journalism.
Yeah. So so like I started thinking about Arnab, right, and his trajectory. I think to break what happened when Arnab shot to fame and his sound and fury debates became the trend, you need to do you need to repeat how he came into power with an inflection point. If you notice, the sound and fury version of broadcasting news wasn't as wasn't as much in demand before 2611 and when
Yeah.
Arnab actually shot to fame.
Yes.
So you need an inflection, like the sound and fury mascot in Arnab Goswami had an inflection point. So
Hmm.
then what happened is he became an opinion leader because he was doing good things in his way. And then his way became the opinion leader. And when he started doing bad things in his way, it was still accepted. What we
Yes.
need is an inflection point where someone doing good things in a way starkly different from the sound and fury version is suddenly in demand because he appeals to the moment, like a 2611.
Hmm.
And then when that kind of opinion leadership comes up, hopefully they won't go the wrong way, right? And his way will continue to be like with the right news. So you
Yes.
need an inflection point where more quality, more nuanced, more intellectual, and like on a personal level, I think hyper localized journalism comes up, right? And where macro narratives aren't fit into you.
Yes, and the irony is that we are actually living in the midst of the biggest inflection points of all, which is the pandemic. And yet, I think it's only resulted in a worsening of Indian journalistic standards in the mainstream media, at least, especially with what the kind of reportage we saw with Corona Jihad, right? But anyway, I think,
So we should put
yeah,
this out there, so it's like you have to, right? Since you're in the field and you're one of the more prolific writers we've got, right? In the among I'm sure like most of our listeners have already read your articles, but where do you think we break the lack of equilibrium? It's like an economic question, right?
hmm,
There's a demand gap, there's a supply gap, right? You
yeah,
don't know, like I don't know how we break the coordination error first. Whether you put in the supply with a kind of a media house that is ideologically sound and does a Ravish Kumar brand of journalism, or do you start with a more structural change, or by identifying a society that demands something of this sort?
Hmm.
And because so till now we've just told people that, or we just discussed how it's a combination of both.
Hmm.
But where do you start?
I think you have to start, and let's look at this pragmatically, right? Because you need your resources. Everybody needs their resources, and in the absence of resources, you can have the best of intentions, but you won't create any tangible effect. So for me,
Yeah.
I think given the current environment, if I, let's say, had to start a media house from scratch, I'd start it online digitally. I would perhaps crowdsource it to whatever extent I can, and I would try to ensure that it has one fundamental motto at the heart of it, that
Mm,
at the end of the day, opinion is free, but facts are sacred. This is essentially the motto that guides The Guardian, which I think is the best example of crowdsourced independent journalism as there is in the world today, right? So I think we need something like that in India. Whether we have
mm,
again the methods, the motivations, and the personnel for that is, I'm pretty sure we have the personnel, right? I think there are plenty of
mm,
young journalists. A lot of them are among my friend circles. And the other thing we need to consider is that in today's digital age, everybody can be a journalist. Like anybody can go out
mm,
there and put their comment through. Anybody can create a
mm,
YouTube channel and
mm,
start streaming videos, and like most people can freelance for publications. So everybody is a potential journalist. So given that situation where we have such an over flow of personnel, it's just about harnessing those methods and keeping those motivations intact. And that's where we have to come together as a society and collectively speak out on the most important issues. So let's say when we talk
mm,
criticizing the current dispensation, when we're criticizing something like the UAPA, we need to
mm,
do it in hordes of people. We can't do it with the isolated voice speaking for lakhs of people, because then that isolated voice becomes vulnerable to the extent that they can put them in jail with a UAPA charge. But when thousands of people start doing it, you can't do that to thousands
mm,
of people. So it's about
mm,
creating that voice of protest, about
mm.
creating that voice of holding power to account, because at the end of the day, that's what journalism is.
Yeah,
Journalism isn't about pandering to the powerful, it's about holding the power to account.
absolutely agree. Agree. Absolutely agree. Just one thing to that, there's a rule. It's called the magic number of 3.5.
Hmm.
That if you engage 3.5% of the population in something, there is some level of change that's bound to happen.
Hmm.
But to direct the energies of 3.5% of the people, even if it's bringing them out on the streets like Nirbhaya or with Anna Hazare's Lokpal,
Yeah.
it's very difficult because people don't want the same things on an
Hmm.
everyday basis. Like
Hmm.
they might want it from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, but they won't want it from 12 to 12.
Yes. Agreed. But I think we can do it, man. I mean, I think Indian journalism,
Mm,
as bleak as it looks, at the same
mm,
time, by the sheer fact that India is so huge, the
mm.
possibilities of a redemption are also present. So
Wow.
it's baked into the system. The same system
Mm,
that has all these fault lines is the same system that will
mm,
have the basis upon which a redemptive version of journalism can be
absolutely.
built. So
Mm,
yeah, I mean, I think we can just for now start
mm,
in our own ways to create change, to bring forward
mm,
discussions that we feel need to be spoken about, and to
mm,
raise issues that are fundamentally important, and not just get into abstract debates, that a lot of
mm.
sort of so-called left liberals do, and maybe that's why we have such a strong populist government in power, because the left liberals just engage in these abstract debates all the time. You've got to reach ground level
Uh,
issues, and
mm,
hopefully from that there will be
mm.
the dawn of a new future, as they say.
Definitely, definitely. We will redirect people to not wanting a story
Hmm.
and like wanting the fact. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. I think on that note we'll end, and hopefully
Yes,
we'll be back with more issues and continue these discussions in the future.
yes, yes.
Okay, chalo.
Good.
Bye.
See you. Chalo. Bye.
Hi, guys. Thank you for listening to this episode of That's What We Said. The media is a contentious issue in India today, and Ved and I would love to know your feedback on the kind of thoughts we shared. What do you think is wrong with the Indian media today? What do you think is right with the Indian media today? And maybe what are the recommendations that you would have for it to overhaul in certain ways? Ved and I will be back with more episodes talking about more important issues very soon. Till then, take care.